China does not need to invade, it just needs you to use its tools. There are 5 mechanisms executing the largest cognitive hostile takeover in modern history. Most people only see the first one, and by the time the second one is visible, the covenant is already signed. Picture a boardroom in early 2025. A procurement team at a mid-size American law firm is reviewing its AI software budget. Compute costs have exploded. A junior analyst slides a deck across the table, a Chinese AI platform matching top-tier performance at a fraction of the price. No upfront fee, no visible strings. Someone opens a browser tab and downloads it that afternoon. Buried in the terms of service, 17 pages in, is a data clause running 3 paragraphs. It is written in the kind of language that looks like legal boilerplate and functions like a transfer of ownership. The question is not whether this blueprint is already running. It is. The question is whether anyone reads the covenant before the lock-in is complete. This is mechanism 1, and there is a reasonable chance you have already signed it. Here is why this matters to you before we go any further. The AI tool your company, your hospital, your university, or your law firm adopted to cut costs last quarter may be the cheapest line item on your balance sheet and the most expensive agreement you have ever entered. Not because the tool is bad, because the price is the decoy, and the data is the payment. Let me be completely clear about what happened in January 2025. DeepSeek, a Chinese artificial intelligence model, appeared without warning and matched the performance of the best Western systems at a reported fraction of the training cost. Within 72 hours, it was the most downloaded application in the United States. Silicon Valley lost approximately $600 billion in market value in a single trading session. Not because DeepSeek was better, because it was free enough to make the business case for switching almost automatic. Nobody read the terms of service. Here is how it works. Vendor financing, which is loss leader pricing that extracts data instead of cash, is the oldest acquisition play in competitive markets. You price below cost to gain access. You recover the loss through the asset you are actually acquiring. In this case, the asset is not money. It is the behavioral fingerprints of Western knowledge workers. How they reason through problems, what questions they ask, which documents they upload, what outputs they accept, and which ones they reject. Every query is a training sample. Every document is a data point. The model gets smarter. The user gets dependent. The switching cost rises. The covenant holds. Here is the historical parallel that should concern you. Japan's consumer electronics firms priced VCRs below manufacturing cost throughout the early 1980s to capture Western living rooms before domestic competitors could respond. The hardware was the loss. The content ecosystem was the asset. Within a decade, Western electronics manufacturers had largely exited the consumer market. China is running the identical play, except the product is cognitive infrastructure, and not consumer hardware. And cognitive infrastructure is harder to rebuild once you have stopped using your own. You might be thinking, we would never use a Chinese AI platform for sensitive work. We use domestic tools. But here's the problem. The extraction does not require you to use a Chinese platform directly. It requires your competitors, your partners, your university collaborators, and your supply chain to use one. The data about how your industry thinks, operates, and solves its hardest problems flows through the system via every adjacent actor who adopted the cheaper tool. You do not have to sign the covenant personally. The network does it for you. The dependency compounds quietly. Once a firm's workflow is built around a specific AI tool, its interface, its output format, its integration layer, switching is not just expensive, it is operationally disruptive. The gateway covenant does not need enforcement. The lock-in enforces itself. This is part of why the timeline is faster than anyone wants to admit. Institutional adoption does not wait for policy. It follows the procurement budget. And right now, the procurement budget has a very clear answer about which tool costs less. Consider what happened after DeepSeek's release. Within weeks, corporate IT departments across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany began fielding internal requests to evaluate the platform for enterprise use. Not from the security teams, from the finance teams. The framing was efficiency, cost reduction, competitive necessity. The procurement cycle does not wait for geopolitical analysis. It waits for the cost-benefit comparison to resolve. And in most mid-market environments, that comparison resolved in favor of the cheaper tool within the first quarter of availability. The second-order effect matters here. Once a firm's AI workflow is built around a specific platform, The switching cost is not just financial, it is operational. It is the retraining time, the integration rebuild, the institutional knowledge about how to prompt the system effectively, the internal documentation written around its output format. Every week of usage compounds the cost of leaving. This is not unique to Chinese AI tools. It is how all platform economics work. But it is particularly consequential when the platform with the strongest lock-in economics is also operating under a data jurisdiction that differs from the user's home market. That is mechanism 1, the entry point. But the gateway is just the door. Mechanism 2 is what happens once you are inside. This is mechanism 2, and this is the one that makes the takeover irreversible if left unchecked. Here is the personal translation before the mechanism. The data being extracted from Western knowledge workers is not generic personal information. It is the intellectual map of how Western industries solve their hardest problems. Legal reasoning, medical diagnosis patterns, financial modeling logic, engineering problem-solving approaches. And that map is now being used to train AI systems that will compete directly against the professionals who generated it. Your expertise is being converted into a commodity, at scale, by the tools you are choosing to use. Here is how the extraction engine actually works. AI models are only as powerful as the data they are trained on. Raw compute matters. But the quality, specificity, and domain diversity of training data is what separates a general-purpose system from one that can replace a specialist. Western knowledge workers generate uniquely high-value training data because they are among the most credentialed, highest-paid, most domain-specialized workers in the world. When they use an AI tool, they are not just getting assistance. They are generating a record of how elite professional cognition operates. This is not generic internet text. This is the cognitive output of the world's most valuable workforce, being fed voluntarily into systems that route it through Chinese jurisdiction every day by workers who are trying to be more productive. And the extraction engine does not need to break any firewall. The users open the door themselves every time they use the tool. Now we have to address the elephant in the room. You might be thinking, data privacy laws protect against exactly this. GDPR in Europe, state laws in the United States. Surely the legal architecture is adequate. Here is the problem. Data privacy regulation governs personal data. It does not govern the intellectual and behavioral patterns embedded in anonymized aggregate queries. When a law firm's associates collectively run 50,000 contract analysis queries through a platform over 6 months, the aggregate pattern of how that firm approaches legal risk is not personally identifiable under current law. It is not protected. The extraction is compliant. The covenant holds. The attorneys who generated those patterns have no legal claim to the value they created. Here is what this means in concrete terms. If AI systems trained on Western professional cognitive output can replicate that output at a fraction of the cost, the labor market premium your skills command compresses. This is not about AI replacing jobs in the abstract. It is about the specific expertise that makes Western knowledge workers expensive, being systematically converted into training data that makes that expertise replicable for a small fraction of the original price. The historical mirror here is the British East India Company's early strategy. Before the company moved to military control of the Indian subcontinent, it spent decades mapping it. Trade routes, resource inventories, administrative systems, population registers. And the information architecture preceded the control architecture by a generation. China's data extraction engine is the cognitive equivalent, map the intellectual terrain of Western knowledge work before moving to replace it. The extra said data does not only train better models, it funds the talent acquisition. Better models attract better researchers who want to work at the frontier. The data corpus becomes the recruiting pitch. Mechanism 2 directly finances. Mechanism 3, and here is where it gets worse. This is mechanism 3, and this one runs on arithmetic that Western institutions are structurally unable to contest. Here is why this matters to you directly. Every dollar of public funding that trained a Western AI researcher represents a compounding asset. The research output, the institutional knowledge, the frontier capability, all of it compounds over time. When that researcher migrates toward Chinese-backed institutions, whether physically or through collaboration arrangements, the compounding happens somewhere else. Your tax base funded the training. Someone else is collecting the dividend. Let me be completely clear about how the pipeline actually operates. It runs on 3 tracks simultaneously, and none of them require coercion. Track 1 is direct compensation. Chinese-backed AI laboratories are offering packages that Western academic institutions structurally cannot match. Not because Western universities do not value top AI talent, but because university compensation structures are politically constrained in ways that private and state-backed research institutions are not. A tenured professor at a leading American research university might earn between $150,000 and $250,000 annually. Comparable roles at well-funded Chinese AI labs are reportedly offering multiples of that figure, with fewer publication restrictions and more compute access. The math is not subtle. Track 2 is the softer play. Open source collaboration. Western researchers contribute to Chinese origin model projects. They build expertise, reputation, and professional networks inside those ecosystems. The contribution feels like scientific participation. Over time, the primary professional identity reorients toward the new ecosystem. By the time the loyalty shift is complete, it does not feel like defection. It feels like career progression. Track 3 is the research pipeline itself. Our Chinese institutions are publishing increasingly competitive AI research, attracting citation networks, and positioning themselves as the intellectually interesting frontier. When the frontier moves, talent follows. That is not disloyalty. That is labor market physics. After World War II, the United States ran a program called Operation Paperclip that brought over 1,600 German scientists into American institutions. Not as prisoners, as recruited assets. Their expertise accelerated the American space program and defense infrastructure by an estimated decade. China's Thousand Talents program, launched in 2008, is the modern commercialized version of that exact logic. Identify high-value cognitive assets in Western institutions, offer superior terms, and relocate the compounding capability. So what does this actually mean for the average investor, the pension fund holder, the parent paying university fees? AI capability in the West compounds through its talent base. The top few hundred researchers in any given frontier area represent an enormous share of the field's total innovation output. If that group is increasingly affiliated with Chinese adjacent institutions, whether through employment, collaboration, or data sharing arrangements, the innovation premium that makes Western AI products worth their current valuation begins to erode. Valuations follow innovation premiums. If you hold technology-heavy retirement assets, you have a direct financial stake in whether this pipeline holds. The mechanism has a fracture point. Western governments can restrict Chinese talent recruitment programs legally, and several have begun to. But the open source collaboration track is harder to restrict without restricting the open scientific culture that makes Western AI research productive in the first place. That defense creates its own liability. The covenant does not require crossing a border. It requires a GitHub account. That is mechanism 3. The talent is moving. But here's what most people miss entirely. The most durable advantage is not the people. It is the rulebook. Mechanism 4 is where this becomes permanent. This is mechanism 4, and this is the mechanism that converts every prior advantage into a structural lock. Here's the personal stakes translation. If Chinese-designed AI safety and interoperability standards become the default framework in international technical bodies, Western AI systems will face compliance costs to operate in global markets. And you do not need to ban a competitor's product. You write the technical rules in a way their architecture does not naturally satisfy. You make compliance expensive enough to function as a regulatory tariff, and you collect the governance premium on every transaction. This is the part that should concern you if you run any business with international exposure. Here's how standards capture actually works. The International Organization for Standardization, the International Electrotechnical Commission, and the International Telecommunication Union are the bodies that set the technical rules for how AI systems are required to operate internationally. Safety classifications, data format requirements, interoperability specifications. These are not visible to end users. They are the plumbing. Whoever controls the plumbing controls what flows through the network. China has been systematically increasing its participation in all three of these bodies. The strategy is not to block Western proposals. It is to arrive earlier, submit more proposals, and build coalition support among Global South nations that have adopted Chinese AI infrastructure. Those nations have a structural incentive to support Chinese-friendly technical standards because their existing systems are already built to Chinese specifications. China does not need to buy their votes. The infrastructure deal is the vote. The historical mirror here is the container shipping standards battle of the 1970s. The dimensions of a shipping container, the locking mechanism, the port interface specifications, or all of these were contested at the international standards level for years. The nations and firms that wrote the winning standard did not need to own the shipping lines. They owned the rules every ship had to follow. Global trade for the next 50 years routed through ports built to their specifications. China is executing the identical play in AI. If you write the interoperability standard, every system has to comply with your technical assumptions. Bottom line, this is not about regulation in the abstract. By the time Western regulatory frameworks like the European Union AI Act are fully operational, international technical standards may already embed Chinese architectural assumptions. Harmonizing European or American systems with those standards will not be free. It will require engineering work, compliance infrastructure, and ongoing certification costs. Those costs compress margins. They slow hiring. They reduce the research budget for the next product cycle. You might be thinking, the United States and the European Union have the largest AI markets in the world. Surely market size means Western standards dominate. But here's the problem. Market size determines adoption in markets you already control. International standards determine access to markets you are trying to enter. China does not need to win the American market or the European market on standards. It needs to win enough of the global south that non-compliance with Chinese specifications functions as a real market access restriction. That is a much lower bar. And the voting records in recent ISO and International Telecommunication Union AI working groups suggest they are clearing it with increasing regularity. The West still holds legacy credibility and seat count in the most influential bodies. That window is open. It will not stay open at the current rate of engagement. The gap between Chinese standards committee submissions and Western submissions has been widening for several years. That is, Mechanism 4. The rules are being written. Now Mechanism 5 is where the entire architecture becomes invisible, and that is the most difficult phase to reverse. This is Mechanism 5, and this is the one operating below the threshold of anything that looks like an obvious threat. Here's the stakes translation. The AI systems generating the summaries your analysts produce. The content your customers consume and the research briefings your leadership reads are increasingly built on model architectures that reflect the training priorities of the firms that built them. That is not a conspiracy. That is how language models work. A model trained on Chinese jurisdiction data, weighted toward Chinese institutional priorities, will produce different outputs on contested topics than a model trained on different data under different constraints. Whoever trains the model shapes the output, at scale, across every user, invisibly. Here is what the narrative infrastructure lock-in actually means in practice. American cultural dominance in the 20th century was not primarily enforced, it was infrastructural. Hollywood produced the content. American broadcast networks distributed it. American publishing houses printed it. American internet platforms hosted it. The result was that American cultural assumptions became the default interpretive frame through which billions of people understood political events, economic systems, and social possibilities, not because anyone was forcing them to accept those assumptions, but because the infrastructure that delivered their information was built on American foundations. China is constructing the AI native equivalent of that infrastructure. Not through propaganda, through economic logic. The cheapest tool wins the most usage. The most used tool shapes the most output. In cost-sensitive markets, where Western AI application programming interface costs are prohibitive, Chinese origin models are becoming the default content generation layer. The information environment in those markets is increasingly shaped by systems trained to Chinese technical specifications. Here is what this means for Western economic interests. Global South markets represent the primary growth zone for the next 30 years. The firms, governments, and institutions that shape how those markets receive and process information will have structural influence over their policy decisions, including trade policy, resource access negotiations, and security alignments. If the information infrastructure those markets depend on is Chinese origin, Western firms compete in an away game in markets that will determine the next century's economic balance sheet. You might be thinking, AI content generation is just a tool. Quality of output is what matters, not origin of the model. But here's the problem. Quality convergence is the entire point. As Chinese origin models achieve performance parity with Western models, which DeepSeek demonstrated is closer than almost anyone inside Western AI labs wanted to admit, The differentiating factor shifts from capability to cost and distribution. At cost parity or cost advantage, origin stops mattering to the average user. But the data covenant still runs. The training pipeline still routes through Chinese jurisdiction. The infrastructure is in place before anyone thinks to raise the question of origin. And by the time the question gets raised, the switching cost has already compounded. Here is what everyone is missing in the current policy debate. The threat model being discussed in most Western capitals is about military hardware, semiconductor supply chains, and direct espionage. Those are real concerns. But the mechanism operating fastest and with the least policy resistance is the one running through the procurement decisions of mid-sized law firms, university research departments, and startup engineering teams trying to reduce their compute costs. The acquisition is happening through the quarterly budget cycle, not the intelligence briefing. If you understand nothing else, understand this. The 5 mechanisms are not sequential. They are simultaneous. The gateway covenant is being signed at the same rate as the data is being extracted, the talent is being repositioned, the standards are being proposed, and the content infrastructure is being installed. Each mechanism reinforces every other. That is what makes this a hostile takeover and not just a competitive market dynamic. That is Mechanism 5. The infrastructure is being laid, and the complete picture is now visible. Same boardroom, same procurement deck, same AI interface on the screen. The difference is what is running on the other side of it. 5 mechanisms, 1 blueprint. The gateway covenant gets you in the door. The data extraction engine converts your expertise into their training asset. The talent pipeline relocates the compounding advantage. The standards play writes the rules. And the narrative infrastructure makes the entire architecture invisible to the people operating inside it. The question is not whether this is happening. The voting records are public. The terms of service are 17 pages in, available to anyone who looks. The question is whether Western institutions mobilize before the lock-in is complete, or whether they discover the covenant the same way most organizations discover fine print, after the terms have already been enforced, and the procurement cycle has already moved on.